There is a moment in nearly every episode of MASH that most viewers never consciously register. The camera is on Hawkeye, or on Radar, or on Margaret during some crisis that has pulled the camp to its edges, and somewhere in the background or just off to the side or standing quietly in a doorway that nobody else is using, there is a man in a priest's collar watching it all happen. He does not interrupt. He does not demand attention. He is simply there, the way a piece of furniture is there, present without being noticed, necessary without being named. That man is Father Francis Mulcahy, and the longer you watch him, the more unsettling that image becomes. Because here is the thing about Mulcahy that 11 years of the show never quite said out loud. He was not background, he was not comic relief, he was not the gentle, harmless chaplain the show occasionally used for easy sentiment and then forgot about. He was something far more specific and far more painful than any of that. He was the person everyone in that camp leaned on without ever once thinking to ask whether he needed someone to lean on too. Everybody needed him. Nobody saw him. That is the thesis, but the thesis is only the beginning.
Exactly. Why, you're a very nice-looking young man.
Father Mulcahy arrived in the pilot episode played by a different actor entirely. George Morgan originated the role and he played it fine, but there was nothing particularly distinctive about the performance. When William Christopher stepped into the collar for the series proper, something shifted. Christopher brought a quality to Mulcahy that was difficult to name immediately and impossible to ignore once you noticed it. He brought patience, not the performed patience of a saint in a stained glass window, the lived patience of a man who has learned through long and quiet practice how to wait without needing anything back. Watch him in those early episodes. Watch the way he enters a room. He never pushes through. He never announces himself. He arrives at the edge of whatever is happening and reads the situation before he moves. It looks like humility. And it is humility, but it is also something else. It is the behavior of a man who has learned that the space he occupies is always conditional on whether anyone wants him there. That pattern shows up in the first season and it never goes away. There is a specific quality to the way Christopher holds Mulcahy's body in the background of scenes where he is not the focus. He does not fidget. He does not perform attentiveness. He is genuinely still in a way that most actors are not, because most actors are trained to fill space, to make themselves visible, to signal their presence. Christopher does the opposite. He makes Mulcahy recede. And in receding, paradoxically, he makes the character more real. You believe this man has spent decades learning to take up as little room as possible because he moves through every scene as though he has already accepted that his presence is tolerated rather than wanted. That is not a small acting choice. That is a sustained philosophical commitment to a character the scripts never fully required. Before we go any further, leave a comment and tell us whether you think Mulcahy was underused, because I suspect a lot of people watching this have felt something about this character for years and never had a place to put it. This might be that place.
Did you know that it was the custom on Holy Thursday for the Pope to wash a poor man's feet? So?
Now here is the first discovery, and it changes how you watch the entire series. Mulcahy is consistently excluded from the social life of the 4077. Not cruelly, not intentionally, in a way that is almost worse than either of those things. He is excluded the way you exclude someone you have stopped thinking about. The poker games happen without him. The still that Hawkeye and Trapper built in the swamp, the one that becomes a social hub for the camp, is not a place where Mulcahy belongs. When the doctors drink, the nurses drink. When Frank Burns even occasionally loosens up enough to be in the same room as everyone else, Mulcahy is somewhere else, doing something alone. There is an episode in the early seasons where the entire camp is celebrating something. The details don't matter. What matters is the shot. Everyone is gathered together in that loose, easy way that groups develop when they feel safe with each other. And Mulcahy is there. He is standing at the edge of the frame, holding his glass, smiling at the right moments, laughing when someone says something funny. And he looks, from the outside, like he is part of it. He is not part of it. He is performing participation, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The show never comments on this. The camera never lingers on it. It is not a dramatic beat. It is just a man standing at the edge of a party he was never quite invited into, doing his best to look like he belongs there. Now subscribe if you want to keep going deeper on MASH. We do this regularly, and the next one is going to be just as revealing. It takes 2 seconds, and it means you will never miss one. Here is where it gets more complicated. Mulcahy is a priest in a war zone. That sentence alone contains a contradiction so enormous the show almost never addresses it directly. What does it mean to represent faith in a place where faith is tested every single day and found, by almost everyone around you, to be insufficient? Hawkeye is an atheist, or close enough to one that the distinction barely matters. Trapper is indifferent. BJ is privately spiritual, but rarely overtly so. The camp is not hostile to religion exactly, but it is not particularly interested in it either. And Mulcahy knows this. He has always known this.
Yes, well,
Please.
thank you.
There is an episode where Mulcahy tries to organize a choir. It is played mostly for gentle comedy. The singing is bad. The enthusiasm is intermittent. The whole thing feels like the show giving Mulcahy something to do while the real story happens elsewhere. But watch his face when it falls apart. Not the punchline face, the face just after that. There is a moment, very brief, where you can see him absorbing yet another small failure, tucking it somewhere, continuing. That face appears over and over again across 11 seasons. It is the face of a man who has built his entire identity around being useful to others and who has quietly accepted that usefulness and belonging are not the same thing. The writers occasionally seemed to recognize what they had built in Mulcahy and pulled him forward for an episode, gave him a story, a crisis, a moment where the camera stayed on him long enough for the audience to remember he was there. These episodes are some of the finest hours the show ever produced, and they are almost always the ones people remember least. There is one in the middle seasons where Mulcahy witnesses something during surgery. He is not supposed to be in the OR. Surgeons do not need chaplains standing over them, and the show makes that point clearly in earlier episodes when Mulcahy's presence there is treated as slightly awkward, slightly out of place. But in this episode, he is there, and he sees something that shakes him. A level of suffering he was not prepared for, despite having been surrounded by it for years, and afterward, he cannot talk about it. He tries to pray and finds the words are not there. Most fans remember the B-plots of that episode. The Mulcahy story sits in the center of it and somehow disappears around it. Honestly, I've watched that episode 4 or 5 times, and I am still not sure whether the show understood what it was doing with him in that moment. Whether the writers knew they were showing us something devastating about a man whose entire professional existence is built on having something to offer and who had temporarily run out. I don't think they fully knew. I think William Christopher knew. I think he played it as though it mattered deeply and the camera moved on and he let it go. That is the thing about Christopher's performance across all 11 years. He played Mulcahy as though everything mattered, even when the script suggested nothing about the character particularly did.
Colonel Maurice Hollister, divisional chaplain.
I don't know him.
Here is something most people who love this show have never stopped to consider. Mulcahy was a boxer before he was a priest. The show mentions it occasionally, usually for comic effect, usually when someone is surprised to learn that the mild-mannered chaplain once knew how to fight. It gets a laugh, it gets a raised eyebrow, and then the conversation moves on. But think about what that actually means. Before he took his vows, before he chose the collar and the prayer book and a life built around other people's pain, Mulcahy chose a sport that is entirely about controlled aggression, about standing in front of someone who is trying to hurt you and holding your ground, about absorbing punishment and continuing to move forward. He was apparently good at it, good enough that it is part of who he is, a fact about him that exists before the priesthood, before the war, before any of it. And then he chose a vocation that required him to put all of that away, to replace the capacity for controlled force with the capacity for unconditional patience, to stand in front of suffering and not fight it, to simply be present with it. That is not a small trade. That is a fundamental reorientation of a person's instincts. And the show occasionally lets you glimpse the seam between who Mulcahy was and who he decided to become. There are moments when something flares behind his eyes, a flash of something harder than patience, a reaction he immediately smooths back down into equanimity. Christopher plays those moments with extraordinary restraint. They last less than a second, and they tell you more about Mulcahy than almost any dialogue in the series. The man who became a priest still knows how to take a punch. He has just decided permanently and at great personal cost that taking the punch without swinging back is the only version of himself he is willing to be. That decision is not comfortable, it is not natural, it is chosen, over and over again, in every episode, in every scene where someone dismisses him or overlooks him or uses him and then forgets about him. He chooses it again, every time.
In fact, I'm not even dressed as I'd like to be. You see,
here is something the show gives you only in fragments, and only if you are paying close attention across multiple seasons. Mulcahy has a world outside the 4077th that almost none of the other characters share. He visits a local Korean orphanage. He raises money for it, quietly and persistently, in the background of storylines that are officially about something else. He organizes donations, he lobbies Potter for resources, he writes letters on its behalf, he goes there in his off hours, which are few and irregular, and he spends time with children who have been left behind by a war that the camp is also trying to survive. Nobody at the 4077th particularly notices this. It is not something Mulcahy discusses at length or uses to establish his moral credentials. He just does it, consistently, without fanfare, without expecting acknowledgement. And this is the thing that makes it genuinely moving rather than merely admirable. Mulcahy is doing the orphanage work at the same time that he is doing everything else. The last rites, the confessions, the bedside vigils, the choir that nobody wants to rehearse. The subtle, endless work of keeping a group of traumatized people emotionally held together. He is doing all of that, and then, in whatever space is left, he is also showing up for Korean children who have nothing to do with the American military and no claim on his time whatsoever. That is not a character detail. That is a portrait of a man's actual values. Not the values he announces, the ones he demonstrates when nobody is watching, in the hours when he could reasonably be doing something easier. The show treats the orphanage as a recurring background element rather than a central story.
Dare you! You seek refuge in this house of the Lord when it serves your purpose.
It appears and disappears. It is never given the sustained narrative attention it would need to fully land. But in those fragments, if you are looking for them, you see Mulcahy most clearly. You see what he is actually like when the camp is not consuming him. You see a man who has found in a war zone something worth protecting and who protects it without making it about himself. That is rarer than it sounds. In a show full of people who are loudly, visibly trying to hold on to their humanity, Mulcahy is the one doing it quietly, in a foreign country, for children nobody else is looking at. Now here is the discovery that reframes the entire series. Mulcahy is the only character in the 4077th who exists purely for other people. Every other major character has a private life within the show. Hawkeye has his fantasies, his letters, his drinking, his friendships, his grief. Margaret has her ambitions, her romantic life, her evolution from antagonist to fully realized woman. Radar has his innocence and his homesickness, and eventually his departure. Potter has his wife and his horses and his painting. Even Klinger has a running story about Toledo and his family and his elaborate schemes. Every character has an interior life that the show occasionally opens up and lets the audience into. Mulcahy has his faith, and the show rarely looks inside that faith. It treats it as a given, as a fixed point, as the thing that explains him without needing to explore him. He believes, therefore he endures. The show does.
I'm no good at step-by-step. You do it.
Hawkeye, do you think we can?
Not ask what it costs him to endure. There are exceptions. They are rare and they are worth finding. There is a scene late in the series where Mulcahy confesses to Hawkeye that he sometimes envies the doctors. Not their skill, not their status, their certainty. When a surgeon saves someone, he knows he saved them. The result is visible. The success is measurable. When Mulcahy does his work, he never knows whether it worked. He sits with someone who is dying and he says the words and he holds the hand, and then he leaves, and he never finds out whether any of it meant anything to the person he was trying to help. He does the work entirely without feedback, entirely without confirmation. Hawkeye listens, nods, says something kind, and the scene moves on. But sit with what Mulcahy said. He has been doing this for the entire run of the show. Every last rite, every bedside conversation, every prayer offered over someone who may or may not have been listening, performed into a silence that never answers back. And he kept doing it, not because it was working, because it was what he had to give. There is a man in your life who does something like this. Maybe it is not a priest, maybe it is a parent, or a teacher, or a friend who always shows up and never asks for anything in return. You know this person, and you probably don't think about them enough. That is exactly what MASH was doing with Mulcahy, whether it fully intended to or not. Now pay attention to the specific relationship between Mulcahy and Hawkeye, because this is the part the show almost told and then didn't. Hawkeye is the character who talks the most about pain, about injustice, about what the war is doing to people. He is the loudest moral voice in the camp, and he is given the most time and the most dialogue and the most dramatic weight. He is also, in a very specific way, the character who most consistently fails Mulcahy. Not cruelly, not deliberately. But watch how Hawkeye treats Mulcahy's faith.
For some time now, I've been comparing the disparity of our callings.
He is dismissive of it in a way that he would never be dismissive of, say, Potter's painting or BJ's sentimentality about his family. Those things Hawkeye respects. Those things Hawkeye considers real. When Mulcahy expresses his belief, Hawkeye either changes the subject or makes a joke, or offers the kind of tolerant smile you give a child who has said something sweet but wrong. And Mulcahy absorbs it. Every time. He never pushes back. He never says, "This is the foundation of my entire life and you are treating it like a hobby." He just smiles and adjusts and keeps showing up. The older you get, the more that dynamic resembles something you have seen in your own life. The person in the room whose deepest convictions are treated as politely as possible and genuinely as little as possible. Who has learned to carry those convictions quietly, because making them visible only produces a kind of patronizing tolerance that is somehow lonelier than silence. Hawkeye loves Mulcahy. That much is clear, but Hawkeye does not see him, and the show does not push Hawkeye to see him, because Hawkeye is the protagonist, and protagonists are allowed their blind spots. Mulcahy's blind spot is that he keeps showing up for people who cannot fully see him, and he never stops, and he never complains. And that is either the most admirable thing in the show or the saddest, possibly both at the same time. Here is the contradiction the show never resolves, and it is the most honest thing about him. Mulcahy is supposed to be the moral anchor of the camp, the spiritual authority.
You tell 'em, ferret face.
The person who represents something larger than survival, but he has almost no authority at all. Hawkeye ignores his perspective when it conflicts with Hawkeye's own. The camp treats his opinions on ethics as background noise compared to the louder voices around him. When there is a genuine moral crisis, and MASH generated many of them, Mulcahy is rarely the person who resolves it. He is the person who witnesses it, who holds space for it, who, when it is over, helps someone carry the weight of it. That is not a small thing. It is possibly the most important thing, but it is invisible, because witnessing does not look like leadership. Carrying someone else's weight does not look like strength. And a man who specializes in invisible work tends to become invisible himself. Watch the finale. The moment the show is most famous for, the moment the audience waited 11 years to reach, is about Hawkeye's breakdown. About Hawkeye's pain. About Hawkeye being pieced back together by a psychiatrist who barely appears in the rest of the series. The finale is enormous and emotional and genuinely earned, and Mulcahy is in it, doing exactly what he always does. He is present. He says the right things. He holds the moment quietly while everyone else takes up space in it. And then there is a scene near the end. Mulcahy has lost most of his hearing. An explosion earlier in the final season has damaged it severely, and this particular consequence is not played for drama the way it might have been in another show. It is handled quietly, the way Mulcahy handles everything. He mentions it almost in passing. He is adjusting. He will manage. He does not ask for sympathy. Think about what that means for a man whose work is entirely built on listening, who has spent 11 years hearing confessions and prayers and dying words and late-night fears, who has been for an entire camp of traumatized people the person you went to when you needed to be heard, and now he cannot fully hear. The show does not linger on this irony. It trusts the audience to find it, and most audiences don't, because by the time the finale arrives, 11 years of not quite focusing on Mulcahy has trained the viewer to look past him toward whoever is standing next to him. That is the final discovery, and it is the one that cuts deepest. MASH did not fail Father Mulcahy, not exactly. It did something more precise than failure. It built a character whose entire purpose was to be overlooked, and then it overlooked him, and in doing so, it accidentally made him the most honest portrait in the entire series. Because that is what happens to people like Mulcahy in real life. They do the work that holds everything together, and they do it quietly, and they do not complain, and the world does not notice, and they keep going anyway. William Christopher knew this. In interviews from his later years, he spoke about Mulcahy with a gentleness that mirrored the character completely. He never expressed bitterness about the role's limitations. He talked about what the character meant to people, letters he received, moments fans described to him, a man at a convention who told him that watching Mulcahy had helped him understand his own father. Christopher received that quietly, the same way Mulcahy would have. He died on New Year's Eve 2016. He had been living with multiple myeloma. His wife Barbara wrote about his final weeks in a way that was honest and full of love. He spent his life inside and outside the show, being present for people who needed presence. He raised a son with autism at a time when that required a particular kind of sustained, quiet devotion that the world did not celebrate or even fully understand. The Christophers spent decades advocating for autism awareness, long before it became a cause that attracted public attention or institutional support. They did it because it needed doing, because someone had to stay. You can feel that in Christopher's performance if you go back and watch with it in mind. Mulcahy's capacity for sustained, unrewarded presence, his ability to sit with someone in their worst moment without flinching or pulling back, without needing the moment to resolve or the person to be grateful, that was not something he researched. That was something he lived. He brought it to the set every day and he put it into a character the world mostly watched from a comfortable distance without ever quite seeing. There is a quality in Mulcahy that, knowing this about Christopher, you cannot unsee. The way he stays when others leave, the way he listens without needing to respond, the way he is still there at the end of the scene when the camera has moved on to someone more interesting. That was not entirely the writer's creation. That was a man pouring something real into a character the show never quite gave enough room to contain it. Nobody really saw Father Mulcahy. Not the other characters, not always the writers, not always the audience. But he was there, every single episode, in the corner of the frame, doing the work that doesn't get remembered. The older I get, the more that feels like the most important thing the show ever said. If you have a character you want us to look at next, leave it in the comments. We read everyone.